Hey, y'all. I'm Kim Stewart, host of the Book Marketing Mania podcast, and I'm so glad you're tuning in today. So I wanted to share my top 5 takeaways from the Spark Media Conference for Christian podcasters because all of these apply to your book marketing journey. So if you're not familiar with Spark, this was the 3rd annual conference that Misty Phillip has hosted. And if you don't know Misty, she's the host of the By His Grace podcast and founder of Spark Media. And she was my guest on episode 9 to talk about how authors can use the power of podcasting to grow their platforms, both as a host and as a guest. So be sure to check out that episode. This year's Spark Conference was in Nashville to coincide with the NRB Conference, which is the National Religious Broadcasters Conference. It's been incredible to see how Misty has been obedient and answered God's call to bring together Christian podcasters to encourage and equip them. Misty brings in a variety of incredible speakers for a day and a half of presentations to support you in your calling as a Christian podcaster. And if you're having any kind of FOMO about not attending, you're in luck because Misty's team recorded the conference and they're offering the conference replays for sale right now. So you can go to bookmarketingmania.com/spark to check them out. And I also put a link here in your podcast player. Okay, so on to our top takeaways from the Spark Conference. Okay, so number 1, be more of a giver than a taker. Eric Nordoff, host of the Courage Cast podcast, shared this, and he was talking about being a podcast host and speaking life into your listeners during a 30 to 45-minute segment. Be more of a giver than a taker. And same goes for authors if you're guesting on a podcast or sharing on social media or sharing on your blog. Give to the host, give to your listeners, give to your readers. He talked about using Facebook groups to build relationships too, and we all know Facebook's been a little crazy lately with our reach, but it's a whole nother story for Facebook groups because they're still doing really well. But even remember, when you hop in a Facebook group, be more of a giver than a taker. Don't just pop in to promote yourself or your book unless that's the purpose of the group. Pop in to build relationships with the community that is there. Another way he shared to be a giver is to feature listeners if you're a host, or if you're an author, feature your reviews. And speaking of reviews, I want to give a shout out to one of my listeners who left a review of the show. Angie says, I'm truly excited when a new episode drops. The conversations are filled with smart tips that don't feel overwhelming. Keep up the good work. Thanks, Angie. Angie Bauman is the host of the Steady On Christian podcast, and you can connect with her on Instagram at AngieBauman421. So remember, be more of a giver than a taker. So takeaway number 2, every journey needs a guide. So Terry Weaver, who's host of Making Elephants Fly podcast, was sharing about getting clarity in your calling as a podcaster. Okay, so this one goes out to my author friends who keep talking about starting a podcast or talking about guesting on podcasts, but you haven't yet. You know who you are. Terry says, ideas that get stuck between your ears can't change lives. Oh my goodness, so powerful. Y'all, God has given you a message to share. He's given you ideas on how to share it. There's listeners and readers going through circumstances where your message is the answer they're looking for. Every journey needs a guide. I've discovered so many incredible authors and bloggers by listening to podcasts, not to mention getting a fresh perspective on God's word, hearing it, how it's applied to somebody else in some other circumstances, but they're similar to ones that I'm struggling with. God always knows just what I need to hear. But Terry also says you can't get anywhere until you depart. So stop procrastinating, stop doubting yourself, stop waiting for everything to be perfect. Every journey needs a guide, and that's you, my friend. So number 1 takeaway was be more of a giver than a taker. Number 2 takeaway was every journey needs a guide. And number 3 is be different. This was from Jen Bennett's presentation. She's the host of the She Impacts Culture podcast and author of the book Be Worth Following. I was so thrilled to get to see Jen because we met years ago at a conference in Dallas, and I just adore her. So stay tuned also because she's going to be my guest in the near future. So you don't have to do what everyone else is doing, is what Jen is talking about when she says be different. And that was just one of 5 points she shared in her presentation on how to be worth following. Be different. And you don't have to do what everyone else is doing. I think we all need to hear this, right? You don't have to start a podcast if your target readers aren't listening to podcasts. You don't have to publish weekly episodes if that doesn't work for your listeners. You don't have to be on Instagram if your target readers aren't consuming content there that you're delivering. You can be different. So in addition to not having to do what everyone else is doing, think of the ways you're different from other podcasters, from other authors, and celebrate that. Deliver content and serve your listeners and readers in a way that's right for you. If you need some help in this area, Jen's shared some key questions in her presentation that you can ask yourself. And again, you can get those when you order the conference replays at bookmarketingmania.com/spark. So, number 1 takeaway was be more of a giver than a taker. Number 2 was every journey needs a guide. Number 3 is be different. Number 4 takeaway is overcome the fear of being known for what you do. Okay, this was from my friend Courtney Richard, who presented on managing media and ministry and how they can both coexist. It's not one or the other. And y'all, Courtney was on fire. If you don't know her, she was my guest on episode 24, and she's the author of the Inside Out with Courtney devotional. She was talking about how we are ministering to people through our books and podcasts, so we need to spend time talking to them. That means being social on social media, guesting on other podcasts, going where our target audience is and serving and sharing content there so they know that you're the answer to the questions they're asking. Your book or your podcast is the solution to the problem they're having. Overcome the fear of being known for what you do. My heart needed to hear this message for sure. And if lack of time is the reason you're not getting out there and sharing your message, the practical plan that Courtney shared for being visible, y'all, that's worth the price of admission alone. She breaks it all down into doable chunks of time because she's all about managing your time so you don't burn out. So number 1 was be more of a giver than a taker. Number 2 was every journey needs a guide. Number 3 is be different. Number 4, overcome the fear of being known for what you do. Number 5, no more feast or famine. This was from Sandra Dalton Smith, host of a Choose My Best Life podcast and author of Sacred Rest, one of my favorite books. And stay tuned, you'll hear Sandra soon on the podcast. So Sandra talked about being your own publicist, which I'd heard her speak on at She Speaks back in the good old days when 800 of us were all together in person for a conference. It was so good. And so I love how she talks about being a giver when it comes to media, especially like what Eric shared in takeaway number 1. But it really hit home when she talked about no more feast or famine. Y'all, we got to do better. We can't just show up on social, on our podcast, in our readers' inboxes only when we have something to sell. We have to be serving and nurturing on an ongoing basis. And y'all, shout out to Sandra because her Sacred Rest book is 2.5 years old, yet I just heard her serving Gwyneth Paltrow's listeners on the Goop podcast. It wasn't even lunchtime, but obviously rest is a topic we never tire hearing of. Probably similar to a lot of the Christian living topics you all have to share about. No more feast or famine. She gave some great tips on content and also pitching the media. And my favorite question to ask yourself is, what can my target listeners and followers commit to consuming? Because that's the kind of content we need to be creating, whether we're creating our own or we're being interviewed by the media. So number 1, be more of a giver than a taker. Number 2, every journey needs a guide. Number 3, be different. Number 4, overcome the fear of being known for what you do. Number 5, no more feast or famine. Okay, and a bonus takeaway for everybody based on my experience with Spark Conference is build relationships with podcasters. That really should be my number one takeaway. Y'all know my favorite way to market your message is by guesting on podcasts, and you'll get so much further along that journey when you take time to build relationships with hosts. So, when building relationships with podcasters, remember my number one takeaway. Be more of a giver than a taker. Leave a review for the show. Share their show. Reply to their podcast episode emails. Invite the host to be a guest on your show before pitching them to be a guest, if you're a podcaster. When building relationships with podcasters, remember number 2, every journey needs a guide. Podcast hosts need guests who will bring value to their listeners. When they're looking for a guide, why not have your name be the top of mind to ask? And when building relationships with podcasters, remember number 3, be different. One of the top Christian podcast hosts shared with me at a past Spark conference that she wished authors would learn to talk about their books in different ways. Y'all, we have to be different. Don't just send the same topic to every show. Or circle back around later. Maybe your book is just the different spin on a topic they've covered that they didn't even realize was out there. And when building relationships with podcasters, remember number 4, overcome the fear of being known for what you do. Get out there on social, go to the Spark Conference, network, and share what your message is, what your expertise is, and the value you can bring to listeners. You never know who that host might know and who they can refer you to and make an introduction to. That's the beauty of Spark, y'all. Everyone's together in one room so you can meet face-to-face and make those connections. Or if it's online in the Spark community on Facebook, even better. So when building relationships with podcasters, remember number 5, no more feast and famine. If you're a guest on a show, keep sharing it as part of your content plan. Tag the host and they'll reshare it to their followers. Don't wait until your next book release to start engaging with them again. Keep the relationship going between book releases. Repurpose some of your favorite quotes from the past interview into social media posts, or even repurpose them onto future episodes of your own podcast. Keep serving and nurturing and building relationships with hosts. No more feast and famine. Y'all, the relationships built at Spark are worth the price of admission alone. I've made many new friends at the Spark Conference and also inside the Collective, which is Misty's mastermind membership that meets monthly. And speaking of my Spark friends, I want to give a shout out to so many of them that have been so sweet and supportive as I started my podcast journey. At the first conference, God introduced me to Vonna Johnson, host of Longing for More, in the elevator, and sat me next to Doris Swift, host of Fierce Calling, in the very first Spark conference that I attended. And shout out to Doris, her Fierce Calling podcast. She won favorite podcast host, which was so fun at this year's Spark conference. And shout out to my friend Sherry Fletcher. She's host of Your Spiritual Game Plan podcast. It was so fun to see her this year because, y'all, last year at Spark, she had so much encouragement to pour into me of just what I needed to hear as I kicked off my own podcast. And shout out to my sweet friend, Amy Debrick, who is also a client of mine. It's so fun getting to meet up with clients at the conferences and getting to spend quality time together, as well as getting to network with other podcast hosts that she can be a guest on. And shout out to my friend, Alicia Michelle, host of the Christian Mindset Coach podcast. Y'all, she won Best Lifestyle Podcast. That's so fun. So be sure and check out her show. And it was so great to meet Erin Harrigan, host of the Hustle with Heart podcast. She also won an award for Best Business Podcast. So I highly recommend you check her out. And then getting right into some of my old friends that I've met at past Spark conferences that are so dear to my heart. Rebecca George, host of Radical Radiance. Congrats again on 100 episodes. And thank you for my Yellowstone inspired earrings. You are a dear. I so appreciate you. Shout out to Rachel Adams, host of Love Offering, and Summer Colbert, host of Love Where You Are. You guys know I love y'all. Angie Bauman, host of Steady On. You heard me give a shout out to her review earlier in the show. And my friend Jen Hand, host of Coming Alive Conversations. Oh my gosh, y'all, congrats to her on the upcoming release of her amazing book, My Yes is on the Table. And shout out to Yvette Walker, host of Positively Joy. You're going to hear her on my very next episode. I can't wait to share her new devotional with y'all. And shout out to my friend Candace Reyes, host of the Red Rover podcast. And oh gosh, I've got several solo podcasters that are sweet friends of mine. Pat Layton, Permission to Pause, Melinda Patrick, Even While, Sarah Geringer, you may have heard her on episode 12. She hosts the Finding Peace in God's Word podcast. Julie Davis, co-host of Things We Know. Oh gosh, Natalia Drum, host of Girlfriends in the Word. My gosh, there's so many. Oh my gosh. The MC, hostess with the mostest, Jody Howe. Holy cow, she was a bomb. She also won the award for Best Solo Podcast for The Air That I Breathe. Congrats to you, Jody. And oh my gosh, y'all, I know there's so many that I can't even think of that I saw. And I also discovered some new shows and hosts that I can't wait to keep connecting with. And I will share those in the future. So please give me grace of those ones I forgot, because I just had to shout out to the ones I could remember that have been so sweet and encouraging to me on my podcasting journey. So again, you guys, if you have a chance, be sure to check out Spark. Again, if you want more info about Spark, go to bookmarketingmania.com/Spark, and I'll have the links there as well as all the links here inside your podcast player. And I hope these takeaways were helpful to you no matter where you are in your book marketing journey. If you have any questions, just send me a DM on Instagram at KimStuInspired. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in 2 weeks to help you market your book one podcast at a time.